Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 2023 Agowitewin Speakers Series. I'm Loretta Ross, and I'm the Treaty Commissioner of Manitoba. We are thrilled to be producing this three-part video series for the second time here at our new Agowitewin Center. Our goal with the series is to bring together treaty-focused leaders from all sectors to acquire best practice knowledge on a meaningful way forward that honors, recognizes, and implements treaties and the treaty relationship. This series will build on our discussions from 2021 and continue to explore the importance and significance of treaties and the treaty relationship for all Canadians. We will learn about the original spirit and intent of treaties, where we are today, and how we can move forward together. It is our hope that everyone watching this video series will take away best practice knowledge on how to take informed action, get involved, and make change to honor, recognize, and implement treaties and the treaty relationship. We have gathered some incredible speakers from our Council of Elders to our leaders to university scholars. And right now, it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, a trailblazer and an advocate for Indigenous rights, Kathy Merrick. Kathy recently made history as the first woman to be elected as Grand Chief of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, one of the largest First Nation advocacy groups in Manitoba, here in Canada. With years of experience as a councillor and former chief of the Pimachikamak Cree Nation, also known as Cross Lake, Kathy is a respected leader and a passionate voice for her community. She has made it her mission to fight for the rights of Indigenous peoples, particularly elders, missing and murdered Indigenous women and men, and those affected by violence. We're honored to have her here today to share her insights and experiences with us. So welcome, Grand Chief. Happy to have you here joining us in this conversation.
Thank you so much. Nanas kumun basi sami tabise we tapmit takok itsage konya mo tsagates. Thank you for inviting me to this important session in terms of treaty.
Yes, thank you for joining us. And I think the treaty conversation and treaty dialogue is becoming at the forefront of conversation at politicians and the leadership level, as you would know, but also by the ordinary and general public. And through this type of series, we hope to bring the different perspectives. Not everybody has access to leaders such as yourself or to elders and others that have that treaty knowledge and that perspective. So we're hoping through this series that we can give just, even if it's a little bit of an insight into the different perspectives, because I think so much of the way we treat each other, the way we look at moving forward comes from our knowledge, right? And the more knowledge we have, I think the better suited we will be to be able to make some of that positive change. So I'm going to jump right in and ask you my first question. And so Grand Chief Merrick, as a respected leader in the First Nations community, you've spoken extensively about the importance of treaties, and I know that was also part of your speech when you were elected. And I was very excited to hear that and looked forward to working with you. But some people believe that the treaties are outdated and irrelevant in today's context. What are your thoughts on the significance of treaties and their relevance to many of the current issues that we're talking about today?
Treaty agreements are more relevant today than the day of endorsement. We need to be able to speak and to bring treaties to the forefront in terms of that they are international agreements between the British Crown and First Nations, and particularly Indians. And very much so, I'm very much so in speaking in that manner, because when we signed treaties, it was not Indigenous, it was not First Nations that signed treaties, it was Indians. And so, in particular, to my nation, it was the Cross Lake Band of Indians that signed. So it's very important that we don't forget as to the signatories of our treaties and how they were signed. And treaties are sacred to our people. They are sacred in terms of the ceremonies that evoke the Creator to leading to treaty arrangements for our people. Treaties are foundational agreements to protect the land, to protect the people, to protect our customs and our sovereignties. And without these, we wouldn't be recognized as governments today without our treaties. And treaties are living agreements. They evolve with time, the spirit and intent, the oral understanding of our treaties. So treaties are forever, and every day is a treaty day, and every day should be a treaty day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for that. When we talk about treaties, and you mentioned some really important points there about them being foundational agreements, about being living agreements, and that brings the principle that they're not frozen in time. They're not something that happened, if we think of treaty number 1 in 1871, but they're very relevant today. They live and they breathe, and they have to adapt just as the treaty partners do. And some of the terminology that you talked about, Indians, First Nations, Indigenous, we have to be very mindful of those words, the contemporary words, right, that we use to describe the partners. It's clear, that treaties are still important and relevant to First Nations, Indians, and how we capture those terms in contemporary times. So they're still important, and their relationships as well with non-First Nations or the Crown, right? The people that have benefited as well from treaty that are not First Nations people or not Indians. So that being said, obviously the treaty relationship hasn't always been perfect, certainly not for First Nations people. So if, in your opinion, how can the treaty relationship be improved? What could the treaty partners be doing differently? And that now that we've heard a lot of things like residential schools, and we're hearing more about children being found in graves, and recently, in shallow graves in BC as well. And I know that's happening here in the province of Manitoba. All of those are indicators that the relationship wasn't a good one and didn't roll out in the way that First Nations had expected. But we're kind of at a reset in many ways in that relationship. So how can we improve that relationship? What can we be doing and doing differently in order to get back at that spirit and intent?
It's very important to not forget, and it always amazes me that our ancestors look so far into the future to protect their people under treaties, right? And so the treaty relationship must be reconciled to reflect the true spirit and intent of our treaties. And that treaty misunderstanding and misrepresentation needs to be reconciled as well in terms of how we interpret the treaties, in terms of what the expectations were from our treaty signatories, and always to remember the spirit and intent of those treaties. And that's why I say it just amazes me, like for our ancestors to be able to do that for us at this in this time in our lives. And treaty partners need to engage and identify common ground and the oral interpretation. And to hear our oral interpretation, it has equal value as compared to written text. So the promises that were promised at that time need to be kept. And we know very well across Turtle Island that a lot of our treaties were never kept or honored as they should have been by the governments.
Mm-hmm. So, in order to, the understanding of the spirit and intent of treaty, as you've talked about, I think, do you see that as being important to be understood by the treaty partner as well, right? So if we're talking government federally or provincially, they have to understand what First Nations people mean by the original spirit and intent. And do you think that understanding is there?
Not to the extent that it should be.
Yeah.
Considering that we're in 2023 and we still go back to educating our government partners as to how we interpret it, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's very important that we be able to educate them in that manner, and not to take anything away from the treaty and what the contents of the treaties were and are still in treaties.
Mm-hmm. And as you said, like the focus is in understanding the treaties. We have to understand the spirit and intent, which is beyond the written text. You've talked about that. We can't just focus on the written text. And I think in that treaty relationship, that has been the focus and guided the treaty partner in that regard. So it's moving a little bit away from that, not ignoring it and disregarding it. But I think, as you've said, we have to move to understanding what that original spirit and intent is if we're going to be able to advance in the relationship, right? So yeah,
very much so.
So part of the work that we do at the commission is treaty education, and our starting goal here has been in the classrooms, K to 12, and that's the first time many people, and even for First Nations people, are starting to hear about it, and then they're going back and talking to their families as well. So do you remember when you first learned about the treaties, and has your understanding, and if it's changed, how is that changed over time?
Oh my goodness. I think I learned about treaties half a day in high school or whatnot when I was going to school. So it wasn't very much so as important as it is now, where we're trying to educate our young people, and that our First Nations need to take that initiative if they haven't yet, to be able to do that, because treaties are so important for us at this time in life and for the future, and that we need to be able to ensure that they know what the treaties are, and that they know that to respect and to know who speaks to treaties and whatnot. So it's very important. And I know that in universities, there's some taught, but it has to go down to the grassroots level where our people teach it to our children.
Mm-hmm. Do you find a difference from, perhaps when you learned about it in school to some of the kids now? Hearing a little bit more. I know internet is around, and certainly wasn't around when I was growing up, so I couldn't search things. Had to ask our elders, right? We had to ask people in the community as well. But the kids now also have the benefit of internet. But do you see a difference even now?
Yes, I do, and I'm very happy that we're able to access the information and online right now. But I was very fortunate myself in my work and as a leader that the elders did come to me and talk to me about treaty, the importance of treaty. And so I always kept it to heart. And I've always stressed when I spoke to treaty the importance of it through the voices of our elders.
Mm-hmm. When and all of that, no doubt, obviously guides you in the work that you've done to date and the work that you now have a mandate for, going forward as a Grand Chief. And there's, for me, there's been two aspects to treaty. One is that what we call the relational, how we're going to relate together as nations, as governments, and that type of thing. But there's also the specific things that are referenced in the written text of the treaty, and some of them overlap. And one of that is health. It's a big part for everybody, but certainly for First Nations people in the communities. When you think of access to health, the availability of health, how do you, thinking of that and other treaty rights, I guess, what is your view on the treaty right to health, and how important is it for First Nations people to have access to quality health care?
That's a good question. And the treaty right to health is an obligation of the Crown to provide health to all Treaty First Nations. And this is something that's really close to my heart, is the health of our people and the lack of services for our people. So we always go back to treaty, and that was something that was promised, that they would take care of us and to be able to access through treaty the well-being of our people. But we don't see that today. Mm-hmm. And a lot of we're a sick people, mm-hmm. and I say that in a good way, because it's the lack of services that go back into our First Nations. So just for an example, for a person, and there's a lot of nursing stations. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. And there's no hospitals. Like for Manitoba alone, there's 2 hospitals in the province for our people. But they were never meant for First Nation people either. They were meant for the veterans that came back from the wars, and then they became TB asylums for our people. Mm-hmm. So the 2 hospitals that I mentioned are in the Manitoba region. And so a little has changed within time, but in terms of the birth of our children, you're not going to find a hospital in a First Nation that has birthing mm-hmm. in their hospitals, right? Because every the mother has to go out for confinement 2 weeks prior to having their baby, either Thompson or Winnipeg, and she's most likely alone because the dad is going to be home with the other children. Mm-hmm. So we're not able to celebrate that life of our children when the mother is alone outside the community. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to our people passing in the community, we all gather because we're all there, right? Yeah. So there's no balance between life and death in our First Nation communities. Mm-hmm. And that's one thing that I would love to see. Hopefully I can see it in my lifetime, where we have birthing centers in our First Nations, mm-hmm. because our people can relate back to the community instead of having their IDs say where they were born. Mm-hmm. It'll either say Thompson or it'll either say Winnipeg. So there's no connection back to the community either, right? And so an outside promise to all treaties. In Treaty 6, it provides the treaty right to health, and then again in Treaty 4, not to worry about disease. So we take it to heart as mm-hmm. to the treaties that we should be looked after in a very good manner, but we're not.
Mhm.
And we're an industry. We
Mhm.
are an industry to society, and it should be the other way around, where we should be able to do the work, that we should have the capital facilities in our nations to provide that service to our people.
Mhm. And there's as in my role as treaty commissioner too, I've been able to have been fortunate enough to do a lot of reading, and some of this I knew from my studies and my own interest in looking at the written word and what's out there in archives and stuff. And there's a lot of not only the oral history from our people, but it's reflected in the written word, where the treaty commissioners of the day had promised that this relationship was going to build a better life as well, right, for First Nations people. And the mode of life, I think, is the phrase that's often will continue as before. And part of that is exactly what you've talked about, that First Nations have to look after themselves, do it in their way, because when they're removed from the community, you break that connection, right? And you have to work then at rebuilding that connection. I mean, midwifery is not a new thing
No,
for us, right?
no,
I know, like my grandmother was a midwife, so there's ways of doing
yes,
that, and there was a lot that went into it, not just delivering a child, but there's so
yeah,
much, right, that's
yeah,
there. And I think those are important things to think about as well. And when we talk about health care and the treaty right to health, and the written text, when you talked about treaty number 6, the written text refers to the medicine chest clause, right?
right,
Which in 1876, when they talked about it, was one thing, but to reflect on what you said earlier, we have to grow its living. Well, what does that mean today? Not that little literal medicine chest clause where they had penicillin and those types of things in there, but what does that mean today? And I think that's part of expanding the way we think, right?
yeah,
It's expanding how then we view that relationship, and how we can make those good steps, particularly as you say in health, when it deals with the lives of of people, and certainly First Nations people as well.
mm-hmm.
Um,
Yes. And the medicine chest was kept on each reserve, right? To
yeah,
be able to where our people were able to access the medication for colds and coughs and whatnot, right?
yeah,
But we had our own medicines too.
yeah,
That
absolutely.
that our people were able to ensure that we were kept, and that was around the time that where we had to rely on this clause to be able to do so much more so now
Hmm.
in this time in our lives than back then.
Yeah. So it's the First Nation way of doing it, but also having, like you say, that when the medicine chest is in the community,
Yes.
having access and
Yes.
availability,
Yes.
right, of
Right.
other medicines and other healthcare. And I know that's a big issue and topic, but I think people have
Yeah.
to think about what you're saying as well in terms of healthcare, and what the original thoughts were with respect to that. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on health. Shifting a little bit now to talk about how different groups, and maybe groups is not the best way to talk, but how different sectors view treaties, and do you think First Nations and Manitobans generally, since we're here in the province of Manitoba, think about treaties differently? And do they think when it was shifting? Well, I guess both of them. Is the concentration on rights and responsibilities, or is it on the relational aspects? Like, where do you think the focus, when we talk about treaties, where do people tend to focus?
There are major differences of treaty understanding with First Nations and Manitobans. And we always ensure that we speak to treaty when we speak at tables where we're invited to, and to be able to share that with our treaty partners. And treaty would include the relationship, rights and obligations, the land, citizenship, and jurisdiction of, and that's why we keep on saying when we talk about land and their interpretation is our partners, they're always complaining about land. Well, it was our land to begin with, and as a government, and we needed to ensure that we had our language, our culture, and our land. And those are the three fundamental things that able us to guide us in who we are as treaty people. And that's what we have. But we have to keep on fighting. And I don't like to use fighting, the word fighting, but we have to keep on continuing to ensure that our treaty partners understand as to where we're coming from. So we need to be able to ensure, going back to your first question, that they're aware as to what was promised in our treaties. And when we look at our treaty medal, it's, the settler shaking hands with our ancestor. And then you see the little, the axe in the ground. It was always interpreted that was the depth of the resource ownership, was that 6 inches, I believe, was the common, and that thing underneath that is, those are still our lands and our resources. And the Supreme Court of Canada defines Indian title accordingly. When settlers came to our land, the Indians were here. We were already here. We're always here. And we have to ensure and we have to believe that we were, nobody come and tell us that we were never here. Our ancestors were here, and we were organized into societies, and we always occupied the land. And we were very kind to share that with our visitors at that time.
So that kind of leads me again to my next question and thought in terms of the connection to the land. But what do you think is the most misunderstood aspect of treaty? And how can we work to address that misconception, or if there are other misconceptions that you see that people have? What work do we need to do to kind of help them understand?
It's the cede, release, and surrender as these terms that they never existed in any of our First Nation languages. So that's where I go back to the kindness of our people, right? That we allowed them to come and stay on our lands, but we never gave up anything. Yeah. We never surrendered anything. Our ancestors never surrendered any of that. So that's the misinterpretation of that. And in terms of land, that's where we need to be able to ensure that our treaty partners understand that, and we have to continuously go back to our treaties to ensure that we relay that information to them as well.
And I think that misconception about the ceding, surrendering the land affects so much of the laws that are in place now, and then which affects the relationships, which affects how we can make progress in building a stronger relationship. So I think that's a huge one.
It is.
There's lots of work I think that needs to be done to be able to address that so people can talk about it. And I think talking about it is probably one of the first things, or bringing people's attention and awareness to that. So if we talk to, in our wishes and that type of thing, to imagine what treaty implementation would look like, what kind of steps do you think we should be taking to make that vision a reality? And you said, I hope I can see things in my time, what can we be doing so that we can, right? So that we can start to see some progress at least.
Correct. And that goes back to the seed release and surrender. Again, I will speak to that and just to relay that it was never, we never surrendered anything. So land is so important to our people. And I hear the cries of our leaders when they try to go in discussion for treaty land entitlement, because there was no implementation of that aspect of treaty at the time. And so we want our land back, to say it bluntly. And if that's something that our leaders are very vocal on, and that in terms of resource revenue sharing, we never had that. And I always say that we administer the poverty of our people for the governments, and we are beggars in our homelands. So we should have a share of the revenue sharing of the resources in our land. And the other thing is, for me, which is important, is to the control of our own citizenship. We always, there's a lot of historic work that has been done in terms of the Indian Act, but it's slowly, in a settled manner. The whole membership process doesn't work for us. So we should be able to develop our own citizenship for our people, so that we don't have to identify the father, like of our children, and if they're not identified as then they're considered white. So that's totally discriminating, and it would never be allowed anywhere else for those kind of things to happen. So what I would love to do is to be able to start those discussions on citizenship. And so we don't discriminate against our own people, and that we bring our people home through that whole process of bringing our people together.
Yeah, because I mean, we always had, we as First Nations always had the way of determining who our people are. Like, I mean, I think you're talking about the Indian Act and imposed legislation, which determines those. It has nothing to do with the worldview of First Nations people as to who is part of that nation, right? And so those, again, are really good conversations that need to happen, because they affect the relationship, right? And it affects people's identity, right? Who they are and where they belong, like you said, all the way back to that giving birth in different places. Well, this is very similar. Once you know where you belong and your identity, it affects you as you go through life. And I think we see some of that with our young people as well.
Yes, for sure, yeah. And it goes back to, as well as to our own jurisdiction in terms of governance, and to be able to do our own justice system.
Yeah.
Because if 80%, 90% of our people are in the system, we should be able to develop our own justice system for our people. and that we include them in our community sharing circles, that the elders talk to them, that they go out on the land to seek their healing. And so, those are the things that we need to be able to work on.
Yeah, exactly. Another example of that, your mode of life will continue. The way that we First Nations dealt with that type of thing is considerably different than the current system. And for sure, there's high representation right now. So, I want to thank you for your insights. It's clear there's still much work to be done to fully understand treaties and therefore to have them implemented in the way that was thought of when we talk about original spirit and intent. What is the one last question, I guess, what do you see as the biggest challenge facing treaty implementation for us?
I guess, no, I don't guess, but in terms of our treaty partner, the honor of the crown is front and center of this relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And the crown has not been very honorable in terms of treaty implementation.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to be able to sit at that table to ensure that we mean business.
Yeah.
I know that a lot of good leaders have sat at these tables historically, speaking the same language we're speaking now in 2023. So the biggest challenge facing treaty implementation today is that the Crown does not want to give up any jurisdiction, and they only use the written text of treaty. As we said earlier, the oral and whatnot is just as important how we interpreted the treaties.
Mm-hmm.
And treaties give Canada the right to exist. Canada's right to exist is a treaty right. Right?
Right.
So reclaiming our sovereignty on who we are as a people, and that treaty implementation must be clearly recognized of our sovereignty and the title to our land and the title to our resources and the responsibility of our citizenship and our customs.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are what it's been talked about for over 100 years. And we should be able to move forward, and that our treaty partners need to be able to not be so resistant in how we and I think we're making ways in a subtle manner as well in terms of that. But we will never give up our treaties ever. And that's something that the elders have taught me, to be able to speak in that manner when it comes to our treaties.
Yeah, they're not going to go away, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they're there, and for as long as the sun shines, the grass grows and the waters flow. So we may as well find ways to understand and appreciate them and understand their significance and what we can do. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing your responses or your thoughts and your perspective on such important issues. I think that's going to help us move forward. And I know your leadership has made an impact and will continue to make a positive impact in the years to come. And hopefully in our lifetimes, we can certainly see some significant change for our kids and, our grandchildren as well. And I want to wish you all the best in the work that you're doing at the Assembly, and look forward to further discussions.
Yes, for sure. Thank you so much for having me. And it really touched my heart to be able to speak to treaty
Yeah.
And that's something that I carry with me in my leadership. So I'm very, very happy to participate.